There are two key mechanisms that I want to focus on when I talk about the most inflammatory habits and foods of 2024. Those two pathways are going to be gut barrier integrity, things that affect our ability to keep lipopolysaccharides, LPS, within our gut from leaking out into our bloodstream, because that's a very inflammatory thing. And the other is going to be visceral fat. Visceral fat is highly, highly inflammatory. Okay? It leaks inflammatory cytokines. It, quite frankly, emits inflammation. So when we focus on these two things particularly, we can manage inflammatory responses a little bit better. So I've got 13 things that we're gonna blast. Okay, the first one is not incorporating vigorous exercise. At this point, the science is really solid. Vigorous, high-intensity activity, even relatively short bouts, is highly, highly, highly effective at reducing visceral fat. Okay, so visceral fat, again, leaking inflammatory cytokines, IL-6, IL-1 beta. That is what it's most commonly known for. Like, we know that when there's a high degree of visceral fat, there's a high degree of inflammation. And we see that in longer duration cardio, that's hugely beneficial for VO2 max. It's hugely beneficial for fat oxidation, for cardiometabolic health, but it doesn't make a huge impact on visceral fat like high intensity activity does. So if you're not incorporating short bouts of intense activity, I would almost say that that is inflammatory in and of itself. The second thing, rancid oils. Okay, rancid oils, oxidized oils are inflammatory. And we could have a discussion on omega-6 versus omega-3 and linoleic acid incorporating into a cell membrane, that whole discussion. That's valid, and there is stuff there to talk about, but it's still too controversial and a little bit too much to really squeeze into a shorter video. But the one thing that we can all agree on is that oxidized oils are problematic. So using things like seed oils and cooking with seed oils, not just because the polyunsaturated fatty acid nature of them is bad, but because the fact they are oxidized. So if we are still using these rampantly going into 2025, I think we need to have a reality check, because these oils oxidize and they oxidize fast. By the time you are opening them and cooking with them, they are probably oxidized. And there are countless studies now that demonstrate that linoleic acid in an oxidized form is not good for the cellular membrane. It's not good for overall oxidative stress within the body. And it's hugely problematic, and it does incorporate into our cell membranes. So forget the omega-6 versus omega-3 discussion for a minute, and let's just focus on getting rid of the oxidized oils. Switching to things like tallow, switching to things like, even butter to cook with. Right? Things that are going to be a little more stable, and just making these incremental changes. I'm not suggesting getting rid of nuts and seeds. That's not what I'm saying at all. Number 3 is going to be emulsifiers. I think we're going to start seeing a big push away from emulsifiers in the next couple of years. There is pretty strong evidence published in the journal Microbiome looking at polysorbate 80, polysorbate 20. In fact, 18 out of the 20 emulsifiers that they looked at disrupted gut barrier integrity. So what happens is the gut is hermetically sealed. It's sealed, right? So when you have these emulsifiers, it breaks down the gut barrier, making it so that pathogenic material can pass through into the bloodstream, and then our body does what it's supposed to do, which is attack it with an inflammatory response because it's pathogenic material. It's lipopolysaccharides, LPS. It's not supposed to happen. So what I suggest you do, look for things that are using lecithin. Okay, lecithin can come from egg yolk, it can come from soy, it can come from a number of different things, and we could poke holes in lecithin, but lecithin seems to be the safest emulsifier. Bottom line is, we're probably not supposed to be using chemical emulsifiers. They're probably not really good to go inside of our body. Number 4 is using cruddy light. If you're still using really wacky, bad blue light all the time as your source of light, then you're probably just maybe getting left behind. I don't want to be rude, but the reality is the evidence is pretty strong now that we need full spectrum of light. We need spectrums of red light, spectrums of blue light. Realistically, we need the darn sun, right? And when you are lacking that, it is highly inflammatory. When your vitamin D levels are low, it is highly inflammatory. When your circadian rhythms are completely whacked out as a result of this, it is highly inflammatory. And I think that sometimes the biohacking community screams so loud that it scares away the mainstream. But utilizing things like red light, or utilizing the full spectrum of light that you can get from the sun at different hours of the day, is hugely important. And it's hugely important even for joint pain relief. People don't realize how much different their body feels when they're getting the proper light. That is why NFL teams, that is why professional sports teams, that is why military special forces operators, that's why they use red light panels. That's why they do those things, because they modulate the inflammatory response through that mitochondrial photobiomodulation. That is a real thing. I put a link for what I've been using recently for particular joint pain. It's a laser-focused red light. So it uses the same 660 nanometer wavelength, except it's concentrated into a laser. So you're using laser light technology to get red light penetrating deep into a joint where it can actually make changes at a joint level in a very quick amount of time. So I strap the Kineon Move Plus. I even strap it for my lower back. I've got 6 blown discs in my back from years of rugby and beating myself up. This thing makes a huge difference. I put a link down below. That's a 15% off discount link. I highly recommend, if you have any kind of inflammatory joint pain, that you try this out. It is super effective. And again, with that 15% off discount link, it's a pretty smoking deal. So I use it pre-workout. I don't really have much joint problems. I have a little bit of a shoulder issue, but it's mainly my back. But I've used it on other family members. And I have a number of people that I know that have started using it based on my recommendation. And it's now an integral part of their routine. So for localized inflammatory relief, it's quite powerful. So it's called the Kineon Move Plus. Again, that link is down below for 15% off. Highly recommend you try it. Number 5, if you haven't incorporated small amounts of honey into your diet, or you're still using another sweetener, right? I would say stevia, monk fruit, honey. Those are my 3 main sweetener choices. After that, it goes down to dates, it goes down to maple syrup after that. And if you're wondering if it's any different than regular sugar, you could take honey in the same amount of sugar and compare it to regular honey, and it would be wildly, wildly different. There is a 42 study trial published in Phytotherapy Research that found that when honey was added in, it had massive effects on inflammatory markers. It reduced inflammatory cytokines, TNF alpha, IL-6, IL-1 beta, massively. And this is a huge meta-analysis. Additionally, there was a study published in the Journal of the American College of Nutrition that gave subjects 450 calories with isoglucidic amounts of carbohydrates. So same GI, one was sucrose, like table sugar, one was honey. The honey group had a reduction in visceral fat and a protection against the formation of fatty liver. Not to mention, ghrelin levels were lower, and they ended up eating less throughout the course of the day. Huge differences. So reduction in visceral fat and overall just inflammatory reduction. It has to do with the flavonoids and the antioxidants that are in honey. All you would really need to do is add like 1 teaspoon up to a tablespoon of good Manuka honey. Number 6 is alcohol. I don't need to spend a ton of time on this one, but alcohol is inflammatory, plain and simple. Unfortunately, I hate to say it, but if you're still having like more than a drink a week, you're probably doing yourself a pretty serious disservice. The more recent evidence that's come out in the last 2 years, but really in the last year, it says no amount of alcohol is beneficial, and any amount of alcohol is really detrimental. There was a study published in Alcohol Metabolism that found that there was a very clear linear relationship between any kind of alcohol consumption and C-reactive protein levels. That's your primary metabolic marker, or your marker for inflammation within the body. Very clear. 1 drink, it went up like that. 5 drinks, up like that. All very linearly correlated. If you still like to have a little buzz or something like that, I recommend something called hop water, which is like a sparkling water that has adaptogens and has these other things. It really gives you a calming effect. If you're looking for more of a calming effect in general, I recommend a product called TroCalm from a company called Troscriptions. That's a really good way to influence GABA, that same calming effect, but without the detrimental effects of alcohol. The next one is MSG. Okay, and I'm not gonna go too hard on MSG because I understand. Okay, it is a flavor enhancer, it increases that umami effect, but it is an excitotoxin. It does light up the brain, it makes you want to eat more. For me, it makes me not sleep very well, but there's also some evidence stacked against it in other ways. There's a study published in Basic and Clinical Pharmacology and Toxicology that found that MSG affected the microRNA of inflammatory cytokines. What this means is that at a very micro level, it's influencing an inflammatory response, specifically in the adipose tissue, which is already going to be inflammatory. So in other words, MSG is potentially making your body fat more inflammatory. I have a little bit of a vendetta MSG anyway. I feel like these things that manufacture like a good feeling in our brain when we eat are problematic to begin with. Now there's foods that naturally contain glutamate and MSG, but then there's really adding it to food to make it more palatable and to increase the desire to eat it. That just seems wrong on all fronts. The next one, number 8, is going to get me in a little bit of trouble because people have their opinions here. But the evidence, again, is starting to get strong. Okay, I love my dairy. I drink a fair bit of milk. I eat a lot of cheese. I eat a ton of yogurt and cottage cheese. I'm just into it. I like dairy. I was just in Switzerland for the last 5 weeks, and I like it because their dairy quality is crazy high, and I can eat it without a negative effect. Less and less people are lactose intolerant than you would think. Okay, very small percentage are actually lactose intolerant. There's increasing bodies of evidence suggesting there where people have intolerances are with the beta casomorphins, okay, casomorphin 7, BCM7. You've seen brands out there that are pushing what is called the A2 variety of milk. Okay, we're starting to see that maybe the inflammatory response that people are having from milk is more so with the casein proteins than anything else. So we may want to start focusing on getting A2 milk, A2 protein milk. There's brands out there that use A2 now. It has less to do with whether it's organic or not, and more to do with the genetic variety of cattle. So they use A1 more than likely in the United States because it allows for more production of milk. But you go to areas of Europe and like Switzerland, it's predominantly A2, a little less production of milk, but potentially much higher quality and potentially less inflammatory. BCM7 is a casein-derived protein, and it can actually increase DNA methylation in epithelial cells. So it can cause disruption and inflammation within the gut itself. Literally, and I quote from a 2024 Nutrition Review study, BCM7 also altered the expression of several genes linked to gut inflammation. We're starting to see this coming out more and more. That was a new July 2024 study. So we're seeing that BCM7 and these A1 varieties of milk are highly gut inflammatory. One could make the argument that dairy shouldn't be consumed much anyway, because like, are we really supposed to be consuming the milk of a cow or a sheep or whatnot? I think we can handle it, but when we start changing variety of cattle for mass production of milk, it would make sense that there would be sort of an effect there. And BCM7 has bioactive opioids in it, which might actually influence an inflammatory response in the gut to begin with. So, in my opinion, look for A2 milk whenever possible. Number 9, not enough non-exercise activity thermogenesis. As a society, we have too much focus on exercise and less focus on just movement throughout the day. There are studies now that show quite clearly that you will offset the positive benefits of your morning hour of exercise if you are sedentary the rest of the day. I promise you, just like I mentioned the very first thing, vigorous activity, a small amount of vigorous activity, 15, 20 minutes, and a day of activity throughout the rest of the day of just getting up and moving around is going to be significantly better for your waistline, for your brain, for your long-term health than anything else. Okay, this includes inflammatory responses within the body. Stop destroying yourself for an hour in the gym. Destroy yourself for 15 minutes and then just be active throughout the rest of the day. Over-exercising is inflammatory as well. Okay, that's why athletes hurt. That's why we're in pain a lot, right? Shorten those periods. Let them be the catalyst, and then let your activity throughout the rest of the day be better. Not to mention, non-exercise activity thermogenesis is probably the largest driver of your caloric burn and probably your fat oxidation throughout the day too. Number 10, you're consistently snacking. There's no denying that when we eat, it is an inflammatory process. Digestion is inflammatory, food is inflammatory. It's all going to trigger an inflammatory response. That is okay. But if you're consistently eating, you're never giving your body a break, you're constantly going to be bombarding your body with taxation, things it has to do. Try to have clear and distinct periods between meals. Just try. Try to not snack and graze. Try to limit consumption of things for 3-4 hours between meals. Number 11 is new, and it's probably going to ruffle feathers because it's new. But we're going to start seeing more and more of it. And I'm going to lead this in politely and nicely rather than in a fear-mongering way. Here's what I want you to do. Rinse your dishes before using them if you ran them through the dishwasher. What we're starting to see now is that some of the components that are of dish detergent, particularly the pods, they have emulsifiers, they have other things in there that are designed to break down food and grime on our plates, on our dishes, etc. That's a problem if we consume it. Obviously, we're not going to consume dish detergent. It's terrible for us, right? There is a significant amount of residue that is on the plates, on our silverware. And if you really want to just get past it, all you have to do is rinse your silverware before you use it, or rinse your plate and just dry it off real quick. Nothing crazy. This residue comes off really easily, but it is highly inflammatory in the sense that it massively can disrupt our gut barrier, but it also has a huge impact on our gut microbiome. So trust me when I say this is a real deal. There's clinical evidence that is now coming out. It's just hard to talk about because it makes it sound like you're fear-mongering. I'm not saying don't wash your dishes in a dishwasher. I'm saying give them a quick rinse. Number 12, a big one, is the overuse of non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, NSAIDs. This is hugely inflammatory because even though in the short term, it's a cyclooxygenase enzyme 2 inhibitor, meaning it's going to modulate inflammation in the short term, how it affects the gut in the long term leads to gut barrier integrity problems. It leads to an inflammatory response within the gut. And net, it's probably putting you in a less good position from an inflammatory standpoint. Number 13, the last one that I'll leave you with, I'm going to put a positive spin on it because again, I'm not trying to scare anyone. Okay, gluten is different in Europe than it is in the US. Okay, it's using more of a soft white sort of wheat versus the red wheat. And there's also other differences in terms of how it's processed and also the quality in general. Okay, when I'm in the United States, gluten flares me bad. Okay, it brings up joint pain that I didn't have before. When I'm in Europe, I can usually eat it. Still have some issues, but nothing like I do in the US. Now, what we're starting to see is that some people have just an intolerance to gluten to begin with, whether it's celiac or not. And that's going to relate to something that's called zonulin. Zonulin increases and can certainly affect gut barrier integrity, which can lead to an inflammatory response. It doesn't mean that you can't eat gluten, but what it means is that maybe you be aware. So what I say with this is trial and error with gluten. If you are in pain and you're puffy and you're holding water and you feel inflamed, then you probably are. And sometimes just removing gluten makes a big dent in this. So I'm not saying with absolute certainty that this is 100% the way, but I can tell you that about half the people that I talk to about this, when they reduce gluten or eliminate gluten, those problems tend to kind of ease up. So again, there is evidence to suggest that there is a thing as gluten intolerance, not just full-blown celiac. There is a scale. As always, keep it locked in here on my channel, and I'll see you tomorrow.